Hi, everybody. Ian Bremmer here, and a quick take to kick off your week. A very good weekend for President Donald Trump. Certainly the most success he has had on the global stage since the start of his second term. And I expect that's going to continue with his trip to the Gulf this week. But let's start with the last few days. Lots of headline announcements from Trump himself. And the biggest one in terms of the markets is not necessarily something you'd call a success. It's more a backtrack, but a useful backtrack nonetheless, and one that we're all glad to see. Trump, of course, kicked off this global trade war with pretty much everyone, but especially with the Chinese, where he was essentially talking about a decoupling between the two largest economies in the world, raising tariffs against China to 145%, meaning nobody's going to buy any goods from China. China's doing the same against the Americans, raising up to 125. China was not going to pick up the phone to call Trump, and he was surprised that they hit back. He thought that this was going to lead to a negotiation and much more careful caution from the Chinese, as you saw from a lot of American allies around the world. Not the case. And so not only did he get his own administration to respond and talk with the Chinese and say, we'd like to engage in person, but also sent Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Jamieson Greer, U.S. Trade Rep, by far the most capable on the trade side, that are senior and report to Trump. And after a couple of days of meetings in Geneva, we've got 90 days off, and we have 125% off the American tariffs. So we're at, what, 30% or 115% off, or 30% for the Americans, 10% for the Chinese. In other words, trade can happen again. And a joint statement from the US and Chinese governments, which is very rare under any government, frankly, with China, certainly with an adversary, to show that there is no daylight on the desire to pull back against decoupling, and also to engage directly between the two countries over the coming months to try to ensure that these trade gets to a mutually more respectful place. Now, what's interesting is Trump had been trying to push so many allies around the world to align with the US on decoupling from China as part of the trade negotiations. That obviously, that piece of the negotiations isn't going to move anywhere. Japan pushed back. Most countries aren't interested, certainly not the Europeans. Now it's not really going to be credible, and I think Trump will quietly drop it, and the markets, of course, shoot up as a consequence of that. So 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. We're kind of where we were before Liberation Day on US-China. Yes, there are some additional sectoral tariffs, and this is going to be costly. But on the bilateral relationship, frankly, not an enormous amount has actually changed. Okay, so that's not a win. What do I mean then that he's had successful time on the global stage? Well, internationally, there have been a bunch of wins. India, Pakistan, significant escalation on the back of this Kashmiri terrorist incident, with lots of Indians getting killed, Indian civilians. The Indians respond by hitting Pakistani terrorist targets, according to India, but in civilian locations, so they don't mind that Pakistani civilians are getting killed. Then Pakistan responded, then India responded, and the Americans stepped in and facilitated a ceasefire. Marco Rubio, probably his single win on the global stage that we've seen so far, helps him with Trump. He also announced there would be trilateral engagement going forward between the countries. That's not going to happen, but we are, I would say, again at the status quo ante on Pakistan, India. This time the Americans facilitated. The Houthis had been threatening U.S. and other shipping through the Red Sea. The Americans decided to blow up lots of Houthis' military leadership capabilities. That was the Signalgate leak that came out. And a few weeks after that, the Houthis said, okay, we won't attack the shipping lanes anymore as long as you stop attacking us. That's a win for the United States. It was facilitated by Iran. who's engaged in direct bilateral negotiations with the United States right now, and Iran in a much worse position geopolitically. The Gulf states would love to see that happening. They're hosting Trump this week. That's likely to progress significantly. Maybe even Trump will meet with high-level Iranians. We'll see if we get a surprise there. But nonetheless, that's all in a much better position than it was before. And so too relations between the Gulf states and the U.S. Saudi-U.S. bilateral relations, including a willingness to allow for nuclear energy and development in Saudi Arabia. Lots of new investments that are going to be announced with all three stops. Yes, there's this unfortunate announcement of a gift that shouldn't be accepted from Qatar of a 747. Then that's going to wrap up the first trip that Trump makes internationally, as well as the release of the sole remaining U.S. hostage in Gaza. And that had been driven by the Israelis together with the U.S., and the U.S. Angry with Netanyahu, who's continuing to engage in a war and taking over lots of territory in Gaza and not allowing humanitarian aid in. The Americans deciding they were going to negotiate directly for themselves, and with success before that trip. So all of those things, announcements that are frankly welcome. The one big conflict where we're not seeing progress is Russia-Ukraine. It is plausible that there will be a bilateral meeting between Putin and Zelensky on Thursday. Zelensky is calling for it. The Europeans, the Americans are calling for it directly. Let's see if Putin actually shows up, or if he says, I want to do a lower level meeting to start. Either way, it looks very unlikely that he's going to actually accept a ceasefire on terms that would be remotely acceptable by the Ukrainians, the Europeans, or even the United States, which means not much progress there. But at least Trump not willing to do a deal with Putin absent a ceasefire, which means the Americans, the Europeans, and even the Ukrainians are more aligned today than they were a week ago, 2 weeks ago, certainly during that shambolic Zelensky visit to the Oval just a few weeks back. So good news over the weekend, and some good news coming this week. And I'm personally delighted to be able to report some things that are positive about what's happening in the Trump administration, as opposed to things that are breaking and things that are falling apart. Let's hope that continues. I'll talk to you all real soon.